Alright, I've got the shutter here from our Retina II type 142. This is a Contour Rapid shutter. It's fitted at the moment with an f2.8 xenon lens. I noticed that the taking lens is very loose, not even finger tight. I'll just remove the shutter retaining ring from the back. Our shims. And our rear lens group, which looks pretty grimy and again is not even finger tight. So there we have our shutter. I'm just having a quick look. The diaphragm moves smoothly. There's a little bit, it looks like a little bit of oil on those blades, nothing dramatic. The shutter cocks. Certainly doesn't want to run. It's not moving at all at once at the half-second setting. We'll try it at a higher speed. Won't move at a tenth. Won't move at a 50th. It might move at a 500th. Let's find out. There we go. The extra tension of the 500th speed was enough to kick that thing into life. The blades are obviously sticky. Now it's freed up, it'll probably run at all the speeds. It does. Probably all the way down to a second. It does. Alright, so that's interesting. We know that the shutter is sticky, certainly needs to be serviced. It shows typical symptoms of a shutter in need of service, that once it's been exercised and warmed up it goes fine, but prior to that, on a cold morning it's hard to get started, like a car with a bad battery. Alright, okay, so there's only one screw holding that down. I'll see if I can rotate this lock with my tweezers, because I haven't got my screwdriver that I used to do that job here, and I'm too lazy to go in the next room and get it. That should come off. So our front retainer is loose. We have our shutter speed cam plate, and here I'm going to take off the aperture pointer because it wraps right round that speed cam and will otherwise make it awkward to lift that piece on and off. So we'll take that pointer off. There we go. The speed cam can come off. I'm just looking at the state of the shutter, see if there's anything unusual about it. I don't immediately spot anything odd. It looks to be all in very good condition. The screw heads aren't mutilated, as they so often are. We can lift off our shutter release. I'll release the spring from the main lever, as this piece is called, and we'll lift that out of the shutter. We would do if it wasn't trapped by something. That's better. So there's the main lever. That's the main drive for the shutter. And this little thing here, the bird paw, that operates the blades, or the lever that operates the blades. Right, so deeper into it. First I want to remove this piece, which would be the cable release socket on a normal shutter of this vintage. In this case it's blanked off because the cable release socket is on the top cover of the camera instead. So that's held in by a single screw. I'll just move up here onto this platform. Will the camera focus? Yes, it looks like it will. I'll unhook this spring from its groove. This is the catch that holds the shutter in the cocked position when it's cocked. It's held in by a single screw. We'll have that out. Lift that catch out. The post on this catch sits down into a recess on the mechanism plate. It's often quite stiff. That's better. That's out. This lever here is used for the B setting, and that's a bit reluctant to move. Bit unusual. Take that out. Take the lever out, lift this spring off. This is our high speed spring. That provides the 1/500th speed. Without that spring present you wouldn't get that speed. That's all we need to do to remove from the mechanism plate at this stage. Now I want to split the case, so I'll remove the 3 screws from the back that hold the mechanism plate into the shutter case. And the shutter should split. I say should because it's stuck. Interesting. Alright. Pop one of those screws back in and give it a little push, I think. I don't know why it should be stuck. It may be glued in place with old oil or something. That'll certainly do that. So I'll get this screw seated. I'll back it up a couple of turns. Hold my case over the edge of the block of wood, push down on the screw, and that shifted it. I'll do it in another position. All I'm doing here is I'm pushing the mechanism plate out of the shutter case. I don't know why it should be so tight, but we might find out. Might be some distortion on something there. I'll do the same again. I'll start the screw in the hole and push down on it. Right, now I can feel that mechanism plate's dropped away from the case now. There we have the mechanism plate and the shutter blades. I'm looking to see if there's anything unusual about this. First thing I notice is that the order of the shutter blades is not what it traditionally should be. Normally The shutter blades are arranged so that the first blade goes here, second, third, fourth, fifth. They're in the right direction, but our first blade has been fitted over here. So it's been set. I'm not convinced that it makes an awful lot of difference what order those blades are put in, to tell the truth, or where the starting point should be. But traditionally, first blade goes here. My battery camera is telling me that the battery's tired, so I will stop at this point, change my battery out and come back and continue disassembling the shutter. Alright, continue with this. Okay, so we're down to the mechanism plate here. First thing I'm going to do is remove this lever. This lever swings the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards, and the blade actuating ring swings the blades in and out, their pivot points being here. So I've unhooked the return spring for the blade actuating for the lever, and we'll lift that off its post. 3 screws hold our retainer in place. Typically one of them is a different length. The longer one is here. Take note of where they came from, those screws, so that you can be sure that the long one goes back where the long one belongs. So we'll take this off, take our blade actuating ring out, and that's as far as the mechanism plate needs to be stripped. I do not recommend taking the retard gear train off the mechanism plate, because it'll disturb your settings and they are not easy to get right again. Next, we can turn our attention to the shutter case and remove the diaphragm blades. So to the shutter case, the outer case. Right, so we have 3 screws hold the retainer in place. I'm checking that those screws are in fact identical. On later shutters, one of those screws is a countersunk head screw. These ones are all identical. And we can tip out the retainer plate and the diaphragm blades. There are our blades. You can see that they're sticking together. That's the oil on the blades doing that. They're not bad examples by any means, but they'll need to be cleaned carefully. And we have the case, and this ring here, which is connected to the aperture pointer, swings the blades in and out in order to open and close the aperture. So we've got 2 screws. And we can tip that out of the case, and of course the screws go through to the aperture setting ring there. So there we have it. We have the case stripped down. This screw on the back is used to locate the shutter in the camera so it doesn't rotate. That was slightly loose. I was just checking that it was in fact tightened up. I'm checking the height of it. Occasionally a longer screw has been fitted there and it sticks through and fouls the mechanism, and as a result it's often then backed off a turn or half a turn in order to stop it fouling the mechanism. That one appears okay, but I'll check that later. So we have our shutter stripped down now, and the components can be cleaned, and then reassembled. Hopefully once everything's been cleaned and reassembled, it'll all work nicely, no problems, and it'll work even on a cold morning. So I'll clean up my components, so I'll need to gather up my cleaning gear. Right, I'll start cleaning up the componentry, and I will start with the case. And here I'm using naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid. Normally I would use Ronsonol. As it happens, last time I went to get some, they didn't have Ronsonol, but they had something else, Venti, same thing. Containers like that are a relatively expensive way to buy naphtha, but they are very convenient to use on the bench. You don't need an awful lot, one of those will last you a long time, unless you're filling your Zippo with it every day. I'm looking at the case. I can see surface corrosion in there, nothing serious at all, and nothing that requires any attention. It just means that at some stage the shutter has probably been damp. Perhaps the camera got caught out in the rain. Possibly even somebody has worked on the shutter previously and cleaned the components, or attempted to clean the components with alcohol, and that the alcohol had a fair component of water in it. So what I'm doing is I'm making sure I remove any old grease, and along with the old grease I'll be removing any dust or dirt. Which just helps to, dust and dirt and things like this just creates friction spots, causes wear. The shutter has doubtless been serviced before. The camera is, after all, pretty old. Dates from the late 30s. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if the shutter hasn't been serviced at least twice in its life before. Probably to much the same extent that I'm doing now. This is the retainer plate for our diaphragm blades, and the other face of this plate faces the shutter blades, so both sides need to be scrupulously clean and free from any contaminants. I'm not expecting any serious problems with this shutter, because I was able to get it to release, and the speeds all seem to run quite well. So I think a clean to remove the oil contamination and any dust and dirt build-up will be all that's required. It's very unusual to have to replace parts in a shutter. They're not really something that wears out. When you do have to replace something, it's usually because a component has been broken, and more often than not it's been broken by abuse of one sort or another. Shutters with delay actions, for example, the delay action is more often than not, if it needs replacing, because something is broken. In virtually every case, if not all cases, the damage has been caused by someone forcing the delay action, because they had a fault in the delay action or a fault in another part of the shutter, and they wrongly believed that forcing the lever would be a clever way to clear the fault, which of course it virtually never is, and as a result they break it. And so you end up with a shutter that required a service, a cleaning and lubrication, but now requires a repair because someone has forced a component and broken it. Leaf blade shutters were always meant to be serviced routinely, and I would say that once a decade would be quite a reasonable target, and certainly once every couple of decades. Of course, when you have cameras that are 50, 60, 70 or more years old, it may have been a long time indeed since they were last serviced. So I'm just quickly going through here, cleaning the major components. Once I have these parts cleaned to my satisfaction, and they are not very dirty. I mean, as I say, the shutter's certainly been serviced before, and probably much more than once. And these components are generally very clean. So I'm not expecting any great problems. Looking at the state of this, I can see that the paint here is coming loose. That's just a bit of matte black paint, and it's coming away. I'll have to remove all of that, or at least remove all the loose stuff and repaint that, because those tiny flakes of paint, they're enough to find their way into the mechanism and stop it from functioning correctly. So I'll just wipe around that once with a bit of naphtha and see how that behaves. I will very possibly want to use some acetone on that and remove the whole lot. Yes, it's very loose on there. Yeah, it's coming away quite well. That I'll have to clean up with some acetone, and I think I'll do that now. Alright, a little bit of acetone. And that paint will probably come out pretty well. That's quite good. I don't need every last vestige of the paint out. Anything that's particularly well stuck was not going to cause us any problem. It's just making sure that the stuff that isn't well stuck has been removed. Okay, that'll do. So I will clean the rest of the mechanism plate here, and I'm using much the same technique, using some naphtha on a cotton bud, and I'm swabbing all the surfaces to make sure that I remove any traces of old grease and accompanying dust and dirt. I'm going to hold back the pallets, swing the arm across on the delay timer or the retard gear train, and that pulls the gear on it back out of the way so that I can get my cotton bud in against the side here and remove any grit and dust and dirt. When I've got the mechanism plate clean to my satisfaction, I just don't like the look of that spring being hooked up there. I'm just going to check that. See, that's alright. Thought that spring had been bent out of shape, but it looks a little bit unusual in shape, but I don't think it's going to cause me any problem. I'll clean this side of the mechanism plate. This side, of course, is where the shutter blades run against, where the blade actuating ring runs inside that recess. And I just need to make sure that's all very clean. Run once around the outside of it. That's good. Now, with the mechanism plate, we have the retard gear train, and the retard gear train often collects up dust and grit, dried out lubricants and various other nuisances. So normally I want to flush that, and I'll do that by running some naphtha into it and working the mechanism so that all the contacting surfaces run against each other and loosen up any of that, any dust or old oils or any other nuisance there. That's good. I just need to blow that out. Just blown out any solvents and any freight of dust and stuff that it might be carrying. That runs nice and freely. I'll lubricate this with some graphite powder once I've assembled the blade actuating ring and so forth back to it. But I will use some matte black paint to refinish that surface in there. The loose paint was on, because I want to see that, get that all done. Now our other componentry, I'll just bring that out here now, and I'll clean these parts up. As I've said, the shutter is in a very clean state really. I'm not expecting to find any serious problem with these components. I'm just checking to make sure they are in fact clean. They all look very good. Now the shutter release lever, I'll look closely at that. The shutter release lever is sometimes found to be damaged on a shutter like this, where somebody has taken it upon themselves to bend the arm on it in order to attempt to change the point at which the shutter releases. This one looks fine. It doesn't show any damage, but it's not uncommon to find that this pin is bent off at some strange angle and needs to be trued up as much as possible. You have to be quite cautious with things like that, of course, because parts are often very brittle. I'm just stacking my fasteners carefully here so that I can find them when I want them. I know what the fasteners look like and where they go. You may not have that luxury when you take the shutter apart. Make sure you're careful to note exactly where the parts came from. Matching these up so I know what I've got. That looks fine, and that brings me down to the blades. Now I've got to clean the blades. The diaphragm blades here are certainly contaminated with oil and will need to be cleaned. I don't think the other blades are in any better state. Isn't? With highly polished, very thin components like this, it doesn't take much oil contamination to effectively glue the blades together. And in the case of the diaphragm or aperture blades, what happens is if they are contaminated with oil, they'll stick together, and when you go to adjust the setting of the aperture, you may discover that it's stiffer than usual, and in practice what's happening is the blades do not want to move. The blades will not shear, they're stuck together like glue and require a lot of force to make them to move. If you apply enough force, one of two things happens. The blades may move, or just as likely they will be damaged in some fashion. Typical damage would include distortion, so that as you're effectively pushing on a blade, one end of the blade, the other end of the blade is fixed of course. One end moves, the other end does not. As you push on the end of the blade, the moving end, the body of the blade in concert with its fixed post at the other end means that the blade doesn't want to move because it's glued in place, and you bend the blade up. It bows up in the middle, distorting. Well, if that's the case, then you can tell when that's happened with a shutter, even if it's since been cleaned and tidied, because the blades are distorted. And in a case like that, the diaphragm will never move smoothly, because the blades need to be lying in a flat plane in order to move over each other smoothly. If they're bowed up in the middle, they will not. And perhaps just as importantly, they are a bugger to reassemble if the blades are not flat, since the pins keep popping out of their recess while you're trying to get the next blade in sequence into its position. Right, well, I'm cleaning these blades one by one. There, I can see a few residual marks on the blades. It may be permanent staining from contamination of the oil from now or from some previous time. And sometimes you find some surface corrosion on the blades. These blades are generally in a very good shape. I don't expect them to give me any great trouble. You have to be gentle when cleaning blades like this. The blades are relatively delicate. If you are too rough, you may bend the blades. If you bend the blades, you're back to the problem I mentioned earlier, that the blades are out of shape, they don't lie flat. It is very difficult to get the blades correctly positioned in order to reassemble the diaphragm. It's worth noting here too that the blades are not symmetrical. The pivot pins at each end of the blade, one of them will be closer to the outer corner of the blade than the other, and you need to take note of that for when you reassemble the diaphragm. And I can tell you more about that when I get to that stage. Typically, when I'm cleaning the blades, I'll lay them out on my paper in the correct orientation I want them for reassembly later. Here I haven't been doing that, so I'm going to have to rearrange them. But I'm just interested at the moment in cleaning all my componentry ready for reassembly. I'm going to have a delay in assembling the shutter because I have got to repaint the mechanism plate, and as a result that paint will take time to dry, and so I won't be able to go straight back into the reassembly. Now I've got the shutter blades here. The shutter blades are much the same story, except of course you do not have a rivet on the blades in order to help hold them in place while you're cleaning them. Here I'm using the point of my tweezers. Be very careful about doing that. You don't want to damage these blades. These blades show more obvious contamination from oil. But otherwise they're in good condition. It's not particularly uncommon for shutter blades to have some surface corrosion on them, particularly if the camera has been stored somewhere damp, and if the shutter had been serviced fairly recently to the time the camera had then been stored damp, in which case the blades may have had no protection from the nuisance oil because the blades were clean, and so the blades would be more likely to be subject to corrosion from any moisture. Where there's been corrosion, it'll often leave mottled patterns on the blades. It'll presumably would create a higher friction as the blades roll over each other and swing back into the shutter, and in that case you may want to polish the blades. And typically I use a metal polish. I use Brasso. You have to be very careful. You cannot afford to distort the blades in any fashion. If the blades are distorted, they won't swing backwards and forwards smoothly, and you would have problems. So I've got my componentry cleaned there. I need to deal with this. I have to paint that inner lip there in the mechanism plate, and then once that's done, the shutter can be reassembled. I won't show you me painting that. It's nothing very exciting. It's just a small brush and some matte black paint.